Hello, and welcome to the Silent Empires. If you're new here, please subscribe and like the video to support the channel. You can also support us by sending a super thanks on this video. Your support truly helps the channel grow. Now relax and enjoy the story.
New York City, spring of 1991. The skyline is glossy with new money. The crime rate is finally beginning to bend downward, and politicians are promising that the old days of the mafia are over. Yet on a quiet street on Staten Island, that promise feels very far away. A heavyset man in his early 40s steps out of his car near an auto shop, moving more slowly than he once did, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to being feared. His name is Peter Chiodo, a high-ranking member of the Lucchese crime family, a man whose word can still move money, contracts, and lives across the city. For years, he has profited from a hidden economy of kickbacks and intimidation that pulses just beneath the surface of New York's booming construction industry. What he doesn't know, as he straightens his jacket and heads toward the entrance, is that his own life has just been marked down as a cost of doing business. In the turbulent world of the early 1990s American mafia, where federal racketeering laws are closing in and paranoid bosses fear betrayal more than prison, allegiances can flip overnight, and respect can turn to a death sentence in a single whispered conversation. Gunmen are waiting. In a matter of seconds, the routine movements of a man going about his day are shattered by a calculated act of violence. Multiple shots ring out in the open air, drawing startled faces to windows and doorways. When it is over, the narrative the Underworld has written for Peter Chiodo seems clear. This is what happens to men who are suspected of wavering when the government comes knocking. But against all expectation, he survives. From a hospital bed and under intense protection, he is confronted with a choice that will upend not only his own life, but the inner workings of one of New York's most feared crime families. To understand how a boy from a post-war Italian-American neighborhood became the target of his own organization, and later, one of its most important witnesses, we have to travel back to the world that shaped him, decades before that Staten Island morning. Peter Chiodo was born into a city still shaking off the dust of the Second World War. The year was 1951, and New York's Italian-American communities were in the middle of a complicated transformation. The first generation had built lives in crowded tenements, on construction sites, in garment factories, and behind deli counters. Their children, like Peter, grew up hearing two overlapping stories, one about honest hard work and another, more whispered, about a different route to success, one that ran through back rooms and private social clubs. He arrived in a Brooklyn that was predominantly working class, where surnames from the same regions of southern Italy clustered together on the same blocks. On summer evenings, older men sat on folding chairs outside candy stores, arguing about baseball and politics in a mix of English and Italian. The Catholic parish dominated the social calendar. Feast days and church processions threaded through narrow streets that smelled of tomato sauce, cigarette smoke, and exhaust. In many ways, it was a tight-knit world with clearly defined roles. Men left early in the morning for construction jobs, trucking routes, or union halls. Women managed homes and children, stretching pay envelopes as far as they would go. Hovering at the edges of this ordinary life, however, was something more shadowy but undeniably present. You could see it in the late-model cars that appeared outside certain modest homes, in the tailored suits worn by men who didn't seem to have regular jobs, in the quiet deference shown to them by shopkeepers. For Italian-American boys in the 1950s and 1960s, these figures were impossible to ignore. They looked like success, well-dressed, confident, never waiting in line. They were polite to the old ladies on the block, handing out cash at Christmas or slipping a few extra dollars to families in trouble. At the same time, everyone knew that angering them could have serious consequences, even if those consequences were rarely spoken about openly. This was the world into which Peter was born and raised. He was part of the generation that grew up after the infamous 1957 Appalachian meeting, when police in upstate New York had stumbled onto a gathering of dozens of high-ranking mobsters. The resulting headlines, exposing, for those who still doubted, that organized crime was a national, coordinated system, did little to change daily life on the streets of Brooklyn. In neighborhoods like Peter's, the mafia was not an abstraction. It was the set of men who held court in the local social club, who could get a relative a job, who controlled which bars and pizza shops were allowed to open, and which construction projects ran smoothly. Peter's family, by all accounts, was not unique. They were one more Italian-American household trying to find stability and maybe a measure of upward mobility in a rapidly changing city. The public schools he attended were crowded. Classrooms overflowed with the children of laborers and recent immigrants. The teachers told them stories about college and professional careers, but the examples kids saw around them often pointed in different directions. In his neighborhood, very few people made it to universities. The path most visible for boys of Peter's generation ran through the street: odd jobs, union apprenticeships, or service in the informal economy that men in expensive suits seemed to oversee. It would be a mistake to imagine that every child in this environment drifted naturally toward crime. Many did not. Thousands of families raised their children to keep their distance from the social clubs and back rooms. But the line between the legitimate and illegitimate was porous, and everyday economic life was intertwined with organized crime in subtle ways. Trucking companies were pressured for protection, and their workers were often unionized by locals influenced by one mafia family or another. Construction firms understood that certain contracts came with unspoken obligations. The presence of this system meant that a boy like Peter could encounter the world of organized crime not in some distant, cinematic sense, but as a routine part of life. Who got hired, who got fired, who could open a bar without being harassed. As he moved into his teenage years during the 1960s, the gap between the official story America told about itself and the reality of his neighborhood grew wider. The country was grappling with civil rights struggles, anti-war protests, and new cultural freedoms. In Brooklyn's Italian enclaves, a more localized drama unfolded. Some older wise guys of his youth were being replaced by a new generation steeped in the traditions of the American Cosa Nostra, but also keenly aware of the expanding opportunities in narcotics, construction, and labor racketeering. The five families that controlled organized crime in New York, the Genoveses, Gambino, Colombo, Bonanno, and Lucchese, continued to carve up the city, sometimes violently, sometimes through quiet agreements. The Lucchese family, which would shape Peter's life more than any other institution, was in a period of transition. Under boss Gaetano, Tommy Lucchese, the family had built deep influence in the garment industry, trucking, and unions. By the time teenage Peter was hanging around street corners and listening to older men talk, Lucchese had died, and rivals within the family and from the outside were maneuvering for power. The succession struggles did not play out in his school hallways or on the stoop, but their effects trickled down. Local crews in Brooklyn took cues from these higher-level shifts. Old allegiances faded, new ones emerged, and ambitious young men looked for openings. In that atmosphere, small choices a teenager made: where to linger after school, who to run errands for, which corner to claim, could have outsized consequences. Young men who demonstrated reliability and discretion were noticed. In neighborhoods where the economy was tight and legitimate opportunities limited, the allure of quick cash and protection was strong. For someone like Peter, heavyset and physically imposing even at a relatively young age, with roots in the community and the right ethnic background, the invitation to proximity came early. He did not need to go looking for the underworld. It was around him, watching. The first steps into this sphere were often subtle, and Peter's path seems to have followed that general pattern. Young associates began not as armed enforcers but as errand runners, delivering envelopes, keeping an eye on parked cars, relaying messages, helping to collect small debts. These tasks were not officially acknowledged as criminal work. They were presented as favors, ways of earning a little money and showing loyalty to men who controlled the neighborhood. For a teenager, the experience of being singled out by local figures of status, invited into back rooms for a coffee, included in private conversations, could be intoxicating. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, law enforcement was becoming more aware of how these seemingly minor activities fed into a much larger structure. The passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, in 1970, gave federal prosecutors a new tool to go after entire criminal enterprises rather than just individual offenses. Still, on the ground in Brooklyn, the day-to-day reality looked much the same. If anything, the threat of larger investigations made families like the Lukis more cautious and more demanding. They needed young men who would keep quiet, follow orders, and maintain the veneer of ordinary life. For Peter, this meant negotiating a dual identity that became increasingly common in organized crime circles. Outwardly, the hardworking, blue-collar New Yorker. Inwardly, a trusted helper in the machinery of an underworld that prided itself on secrecy. He is reported to have held legitimate jobs, as many mob associates did, using them both as actual sources of income and as cover for his growing involvement in illicit activities. In the construction and building trades in particular, the line between lawful work and criminal exploitation was thin. The Lukis family and their counterparts in other families had recognized for decades that controlling unions, trucking routes, and supply contracts in construction could yield steady, relatively low-risk profits. This environment, with its mix of normalcy and intimidation, shaped Peter's understanding of how power functioned. Respect did not come from degrees or corporate titles. It came from a reputation for enforcing obligations, for making sure debts were paid and agreements honored, whether those agreements were written down or sealed with a handshake over an espresso. The culture reinforced loyalty above all else. Speaking to the authorities about internal matters was not just frowned upon, it was condemned as a betrayal of the community itself. Stories about men who broke this unwritten code, real or embellished, circulated as cautionary tales. At the same time, the young men around Peter could see that those who advanced in this world often came from families with existing connections, or from tight friendship circles that had proven themselves in smaller jobs. Networks mattered. Some later accounts suggest that Peter developed early ties to figures who would themselves rise within the Lukis hierarchy, including men like Vittorio, Vic Amuso, and Anthony Gaspite Casso, who were then climbing their own ladders through Brooklyn-based crews. Whether those relationships began as boyhood acquaintance, neighborhood familiarity, or early business dealings, they placed Peter in the orbit of future decision-makers. Through the 1970s, as New York City teetered on the brink of financial collapse, the importance of such connections only grew. The municipal fiscal crisis created chaos in public spending and infrastructure, but for organized crime families, it also expanded opportunities in exactly the sectors they already influenced. Public housing renovations, infrastructure repairs, and large-scale construction projects offered lucrative contracts. The Lukis family, along with others, continued to extend their reach into these areas, using a combination of corrupt union officials, subcontractors willing to go along with extortion, and violence when necessary. For a man like Peter, this period was formative. He was no longer merely a teenager running errands. He was stepping into the role of a serious associate whose work could impact millions of dollars in contracts and scores of workers. He developed a reputation within that world for reliability and for an ability to navigate both the street-level personalities and the larger financial picture. Physically, he was becoming the man he would later be known as: large, commanding, a presence that filled a room. The nickname that would eventually follow him, Fat Pete, was not yet part of public record, but his build and demeanor already marked him as someone not easily ignored. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was slowly tightening its focus. Undercover operations and wiretaps, once limited in scope, became more common. Federal and local investigators were beginning to understand that behind every seemingly personal dispute over a debt or a truck route might be a chain of command reaching up into the heart of a crime family. Arrests of soldiers and associates in the 1970s and early 1980s periodically shook specific crews. Yet the structure remained resilient, adapted, and for a time even strengthened as younger, more ruthless leaders emerged. Peter's early brushes with the legal system were part of this broader pattern. Like many associates, he attracted police attention as his activities escalated. Although for years the cases against him and his peers were relatively limited compared to what would come later. Minor charges, investigations that went nowhere, or arrests that ended in light sentences or dismissals were all part of the terrain. In the culture of the mafia, such encounters with law enforcement could even function as a twisted badge of commitment, evidence that a man was playing in the higher stakes arena. By the dawn of the 1980s, the outline of Peter Chiodo's future life was firmly in place. He was tied by loyalty, habit, and economic dependence to the Lucchese family. The construction and union rackets that had fed his rise were becoming central targets of federal investigations, even as they continued to generate significant profits. Within the family, alliances were hardening. Older bosses were facing prison terms or death, and ambitious figures from Brooklyn were positioning themselves to take control. Peter's relationships with these men, forged over years of shared work and mutual advantage, would soon thrust him deeper into the inner circle. The boy who had grown up watching well-dressed men on Brooklyn corners had become one of them, someone others watched and deferred to. Yet the same forces that had made this possible, the intertwining of legitimate industry and criminal coercion, the evolving tools of federal law, and the insular code of loyalty that defined his world, were also laying the groundwork for a series of events that would test that code in ways few in his position had ever faced. Long before that spring morning on Staten Island, the seeds of conflict were already sown in the streets where he learned what power looked like, and in the choices he made as a young man navigating between the promises of the straight world and the pull of the one that operated in the shadows. By the early 1980s, New York City was wearing a new face. The worst of the fiscal crisis had passed. Skyscrapers were climbing again over Manhattan, and cranes dotted the skyline from the outer borough waterfronts to Midtown's avenues. Beneath this new architecture of glass and steel, however, the old systems of control were very much alive. The building trades, cement, steel, sheetrock, glass, and windows, were still in large part gate-kept by organized crime. For the Lucchese family, the construction rebound meant a chance to deepen revenue streams that were already decades old, and men like Peter Chiodo were positioned to benefit. By this time, Peter was no longer the kid hustling for pocket money. He had put in years of quiet service as an associate and had proven himself useful to established Lucchese figures. He had a reputation among his peers as dependable and unflinching, someone who followed orders and kept his mouth shut when law enforcement came around. Within the opaque hierarchy of the mafia, where formal records didn't exist but everyone knew who was who, that kind of reputation mattered. It opened doors into more sensitive rackets, where a single mistake could cost not only money but lives. According to federal court records and later testimony, Peter was formally inducted as a made man in the Lucchese family sometime around the late 1970s or early 1980s, during the reign of Boss Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo. The ceremony itself, held in secrecy, witnessed only by trusted members, was part of a long-standing ritual that bound the inductee to the family above all other loyalties. For Peter, it was both a personal milestone and a confirmation of what his daily life had already become. From that point forward, he was not just an associate. He was a full member, answerable to the family's leadership and entitled in return to a measure of protection and status. Corallo's Lucchese family was especially strong in labor and construction racketeering. The boss quietly wielded influence over trucking companies, garment center unions, and concrete suppliers. When Peter looked upward in the hierarchy, he saw men like Vittorio, Vic, Amuso, and Anthony Cass, rising fast as key figures in Brooklyn-based crews that handled everything from loan sharking and illegal gambling to large-scale extortion of businesses. These men were aggressive, shrewd, and unafraid of expanding into new revenue sources. Peter's growing association with their circle would prove decisive for his career. On the ground, the work Peter carried out rarely resembled the dramatized images of organized crime favored in movies. Much of it was mundane, administrative in its own way. He met with contractors in diners and office back rooms to talk about bids and deadlines, not because he knew how to pour concrete or hang windows, but because he and the men behind him could decide whether those jobs moved forward or stalled. The message, usually unspoken but always understood, was simple. Cooperate with the program, and your trucks won't be delayed, your materials won't go missing, and your workers won't suddenly find themselves facing harassment or labor disputes. In exchange for this dubious protection, companies were expected to pay regular sums or agree to inflate contracts so that a portion of the money came back to the family. Sometimes the arrangement was cloaked in the language of consulting or labor peace. Other times it was more direct. An envelope on a specific date, a demand to use a particular supplier or subcontractor known to be controlled by the mob. Peter's role was to keep these streams of money flowing smoothly, to mediate problems, and when necessary, to remind reluctant business owners why compliance was in their interest. Violence or the threat of it lurked in the background, even if it didn't surface every day. Law enforcement knew that such systems existed, but proving them in court was difficult. Victims were often unwilling to testify. Some believed that paying off the mob was simply part of doing business in New York, while others feared for their own safety if they spoke out. The introduction of RICO gave prosecutors a way to treat extortion, fraud, and conspiracies as interconnected parts of a broader criminal enterprise. Throughout the early 1980s, FBI agents and U.S. attorneys in the southern and eastern districts of New York began to focus more intently on the relationships between mafia families and the construction industry. In this climate, Peter's visibility inside the Lucchese organization increased. Reliable insiders from that era have described him as a key player in the family's construction and union operations, with responsibilities that spanned Brooklyn, parts of the Bronx, and eventually Staten Island. Outwardly, he maintained a set of legitimate activities, investments in small businesses, involvement in construction-related firms, and later, interests that provided a cover for his income. Like many mobsters of his generation, he straddled two worlds. He could show up at a child's school event one day and sit in on a meeting about how to divide profits from a public construction contract the next. The mid-1980s deal a major shock to the mafia's leadership structure. In 1985 and 1986, the federal commission case in Manhattan targeted the heads of several New York families, including Tony Dux Corallo. Prosecutors accused them of collectively overseeing a cartel-like arrangement in the city's concrete industry, fixing prices, and steering large contracts among favored companies under mafia control. The evidence included secretly recorded conversations from a bug planted in Corallo's automobile, where he had discussed sensitive matters with apparent confidence that he was beyond the government's reach. In 1986, Corallo and other top bosses were convicted and handed long prison terms. For the Lucchese family, Corallo's removal created a leadership vacuum that men like Amuso and Casso were quick to fill. Corallo is widely reported to have designated Amuso as his successor. With the older generation largely behind bars, Amuso assumed the role of boss, and Casso became his powerful underboss and closest advisor. This changing of the guard had ripple effects throughout the organization. Promotions were made, loyalties tested, and some long-standing practices re-examined. The new regime was known for being especially suspicious and willing to use internal violence to maintain discipline. Amuso and Casso needed reliable captains, men who could run crews, oversee lucrative rackets, and transmit orders without drawing unnecessary attention. It was during this period that Peter rose to the position of capo, or captain, a significant step up the mafia ladder. As a captain, he commanded his own crew of soldiers and associates, collecting tribute from their activities and passing a substantial share up to the family leadership. His stature inside the Lucchese enterprise grew accordingly. He became a man whose calls got returned, whose presence at a meeting signaled that serious business was being discussed. Peter's sphere of influence expanded most notably in the realm of labor and construction racketeering, particularly involving the city's sprawling public housing system. The New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, managed thousands of buildings and millions of windows, many of them old and in need of replacement. Beginning in the late 1970s and extending well into the 1980s, the window replacement market became a target for organized crime. Several companies, ostensibly independent, were in fact controlled or heavily influenced by different mafia families. Through bid rigging, intimidation, and secret agreements, the families carved up the lucrative contracts among themselves. This scheme would later become known publicly as the Windows case, but in the years when it was operating, it looked from the outside like standard municipal contracting. Firms submitted bids, the city evaluated them, and work proceeded. Inside, however, the process was carefully steered. Representatives from the Lucchese, Genovese, Gambino, and Colombo families, among others, coordinated to keep competition controlled and profits high. Contractors who wanted a share of the work often discovered that they were expected to pay a percentage of their revenue to mob-connected intermediaries or risk being shut out entirely. Multiple sources, including later court testimony from Peter himself, identify him as the primary Lucchese point man in the scheme. He was not the ultimate boss. That was Amuso, with Casso at his side. But he functioned as the day-to-day manager who translated high-level agreements into street-level enforcement. If the families had agreed that a particular window company would win a specific bid, it was partly Peter's job to make sure no other firm interfered. He relayed instructions, collected payments, and if a contractor or union official hesitated, reminded them of the consequences. In practice, this work involved countless seemingly banal interactions. Peter met contractors for coffee, visited construction sites, and attended gatherings that on paper looked like ordinary business meetings. Behind the polite small talk, there was often a quieter agenda, verifying that a company was honoring its commitments, that a foreman understood which workers could be hired and which unions were off-limits, that no one was talking to investigators. The money that passed from these schemes, tens of millions of dollars over the life of the operation, according to federal estimates, was filtered upward, feeding an underground economy sustained by fear and mutual self-interest. As his responsibilities grew, so did Peter's exposure to legal risk. The same actions that elevated him within the Lucchese family also made him a more attractive target for investigators trying to reach the top. Throughout the late 1980s, federal and local law enforcement agencies were intensifying their efforts to penetrate the construction rackets. Undercover agents posed as contractors, informants wore hidden microphones to meetings, and court-authorized wiretaps monitored conversations in social clubs, offices, and cars. The image of the mafia as an impenetrable fortress was cracking under the pressure of technology and the willingness of some insiders to cooperate in exchange for leniency. At home, Peter tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Like many Staten Island residents of his generation, he had moved there to escape the denser streets of Brooklyn, trading tenements and row houses for more spacious homes and quieter blocks. Neighbors recall him as a conspicuous presence but not necessarily a menacing one. A large man, often casually dressed when not in business attire, who could be seen coming and going at regular hours. To casual observers, he might have looked like a successful contractor or small business owner, part of the wave of upwardly mobile families seeking a better environment for their children. This dual existence required constant compartmentalization. Family gatherings, religious ceremonies, and school events coexisted with tense meetings over unpaid debts or internal disputes. The culture of omerta, the code of silence, extended into the home in subtler ways. Questions about work might be deflected or answered in generalities. Explaining sudden trips, unusual phone calls, or late-night meetings became a matter of habit. For wives and children of organized crime figures, life often meant living with unanswered questions, and a vague but persistent sense that dangerous forces hovered just beyond the front door. Meanwhile, investigators were closing in on the Windows scheme. By the late 1980s, federal prosecutors in Manhattan had assembled a substantial case involving intercepted communications, financial records, and cooperating witnesses. They alleged that the mafia had manipulated more than $100 million worth of window contracts through extortion, fraud, and bid rigging, driving up costs for taxpayers and entrenching mob-controlled firms in the city's public housing bureaucracy. The case did not center on spectacular acts of violence. Instead, it focused on the systematic corruption of a vital public service. When the indictment was finally unsealed in 1990, it named numerous figures from multiple families, including bosses, captains, soldiers, contractors, and union officials. Among those charged was Peter Chiodo. He was accused of participating in the extortion and bid rigging that underpinned the Windows racket, acting as a key intermediary for the Lucchese family's interests. The charges carried potentially long prison sentences under RICO, especially when combined with allegation of using the threat of violence to enforce the conspiracy's decisions. For Peter, the indictment was a turning point. Up to that moment, he had largely succeeded in balancing his criminal responsibilities with a relatively limited criminal record. Now he was facing the full weight of a major federal prosecution, the kind of case designed not merely to punish individuals, but to destabilize entire criminal networks. He retained attorneys, entered a not guilty plea along with several co-defendants, and prepared to fight the charges. Within the Lucchese family, his decision to stand firm was expected. Cooperation with the government was unthinkable for a man in his position, especially under the unforgiving leadership of Amuso and Casso. From the perspective of federal investigators, however, the indictment represented only the beginning of a deeper strategy. By charging mid- and upper-level figures like Peter alongside bosses and frontline operatives, prosecutors hoped to create fractures within the organization. The potential for long sentences, especially for men with families, created pressure points. Would any of them, faced with the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in prison, choose to break the code of silence? This question haunted the upper ranks of the Lucchese family, feeding a climate of suspicion and fear. Inside the underworld, the Windows case also altered calculations. Money that had once flowed smoothly from construction contracts now carried an added risk. Contractors worried that every meeting might be watched, every phone call recorded. Union officials linked to the scheme felt the heat, some of them quietly reconsidering their alliances. For Peter, the indictment tightened the circle. He was now under intense scrutiny, required to appear in court hearings, meet with lawyers, and navigate a daily life where surveillance was not just a possibility but a likelihood. Still, outwardly, he maintained the posture of a loyal captain. He attended the necessary legal proceedings, conferred with his co-defendants, and signaled that he remained committed to the family's line. This was not mere bravado. In the world he inhabited, loyalty was both a moral obligation and a practical necessity. Any hint of wavering could be interpreted by his superiors as a sign that he might one day cooperate with prosecutors, a suspicion that, under the ruthless logic of Amuso and Casso's regime, could prove fatal. The irony was that the very qualities that had lifted Peter to prominence, his reliability, his deep involvement in sensitive money-making schemes, his proximity to the bosses, now made him a figure of special concern on all sides. Prosecutors saw him as a potentially valuable target who knew how the construction rackets worked from the inside. His own leaders saw him as someone who knew too much, someone whose potential betrayal could expose not just the Windows scheme, but a whole range of criminal activities stretching back years. Between those two pressures, the ground under his feet was beginning to shift. As 1990 turned to 1991, Peter's legal problems intensified. The Windows case moved forward, pre-trial motions unfolded, and the prospect of a lengthy trial loomed. News coverage, while not focused solely on him, mentioned his name among the array of accused mob figures. This publicity chipped away at whatever anonymity he had once enjoyed. For his family, the gravity of the situation became harder to ignore. A conviction could mean that the husband and father who had always seemed able to navigate trouble would be absent for a decade or more. For the Lukey's leadership, the sight of a captain under such pressure was alarming. In that tense atmosphere, where every movement was watched and every word might be recorded, the calculations made within the upper echelons of the Lukey's family grew darker. Amuso and Casso, already inclined toward severe measures against perceived disloyalty, began to view high-ranking members facing major indictments with increasing distrust. The logic was brutal and simple. A man facing decades in prison might decide that cooperating with the government was his only way out. To them, the best way to prevent such cooperation was to remove the risk before it materialized. Unbeknownst to Peter, conversations about his future were taking place in rooms he did not enter. The same path that had carried him from Brooklyn street corners into the heart of the Lukey's machine, through construction schemes and labor rackets, had now delivered him to a different kind of crossroads. On one side stood the prosecutors, building a case in files and wiretap transcripts. On the other, his own bosses, weighing how far they could trust a man in his position. The life he had constructed, balancing family, neighborhood respect, and concealed criminal power, was about to be tested under conditions more extreme than anything he had yet faced. By the time winter loosened its grip on New York in early 1991, the pressure around Peter Chiodo had become almost unbearable. His name was written in black ink on federal indictments. His every move was of interest to investigators, and somewhere above him in the Lukey's chain of command, men he had known for years were weighing his fate. Outwardly, he went about his life with the same heavy, deliberate stride, still a captain, still a man of standing. Inwardly, he was facing choices that the Mafia Code pretended did not exist. How much of his own future he was willing to sacrifice. How far he could trust the people who now seemed to watch him as closely as the government did. The Windows case had crystallized everything. Charged under RICO with extortion and bid rigging connected to the sprawling window replacement contracts, Peter knew the evidence against him was serious. Prosecutors had documents, tapes, and witnesses. In that position, defendants often tried to cut their losses by pleading guilty, hopping for a somewhat shorter sentence in exchange for sparing the court a trial. In early 1991, Peter chose that route. He entered a guilty plea on racketeering charges tied to the scheme. Crucially, he did so without agreeing to testify against anyone else. In the careful language of federal court, a guilty plea did not automatically mean cooperation. He admitted his involvement but refused to implicate his superiors or peers. From his perspective, this allowed him to honor the code he had lived by while attempting to reduce the years he might spend behind bars. Inside the Lukey's family, however, the gesture was not received as he intended. Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso, both fugitives by then and deeply suspicious of any contact between their men and federal authorities, viewed a guilty plea as a dangerous step toward full collaboration. To them, The mere fact that Peter had sat in rooms with prosecutors, discussed his case, and admitted guilt in open court suggested a crack in his loyalty. In the paranoid environment that surrounded the Lucchese leadership at the start of the 1990s, that kind of perceived weakness could be grounds for a death sentence. The broader mafia world was only feeding this paranoia. In late 1991, the public would be stunned by news that Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, the Gambino underboss, had chosen to cooperate against his own boss, John Gotti. But even before that bombshell became public, law enforcement circles knew that high-ranking mobsters were becoming more willing to turn state's evidence when faced with the possibility of life in prison. For bosses like Amuso and Casso, the example was chilling. If an underboss from another family could flip, why not a captain from theirs? It was in this atmosphere that the decision was made. Peter had to go. Orders filtered down through trusted channels. The men chosen to carry out the attack were not strangers. They were part of the same criminal ecosystem that Peter had helped maintain. That fact would later underscore to him just how fragile his standing in the organization truly was. On the morning of May 8, 1991, Peter followed a routine that must have felt, in its familiarity, like a small bulwark against the chaos of his legal situation. He drove to a Staten Island auto repair shop he frequented, a place where business matters could be discussed under the cover of car maintenance and neighborhood familiarity. The shop was unremarkable to passers-by. Bays open to the street, the smell of oil and exhaust hanging in the air, radio music leaking from within. He parked, stepped out of his vehicle, and started walking toward the entrance. There was nothing to indicate that this moment differed from hundreds of similar arrivals over the years. Then, almost without warning, it changed. Gunmen emerged and opened fire at close range. In a matter of seconds, multiple shots struck him. The quiet of a routine errand shattered into chaos. The sharp cracks of gunfire, the scramble of bystanders seeking cover, the stunned disbelief of those who recognized the man collapsing to the ground. Accounts differ slightly on the exact number of bullets that hit him. Some say 12, others 13, but all agree on the essential point. He was struck again and again at close range, the kind of assault few people survive. Yet against all reasonable expectation, Peter did not die on that pavement. Emergency responders rushed him to a hospital where surgeons fought to stabilize him. Later reporting would highlight a detail that became almost a dark anecdote. His large body mass, which had given him the nickname Fat Pete, may have helped keep some bullets from reaching vital organs. The attack was a message, and not only to Peter. Within the underworld, the news traveled fast. A Lucchese captain, a made man in good standing as far as the public record showed, had been targeted and nearly killed by his own organization. The reason, though not formally announced, was understood in whispers and knowing looks. In a family led by fugitives whose fear of betrayal was growing daily, no one was beyond suspicion. In the hospital, under heavy guard, Peter had time to consider the meaning of what had happened. Federal agents saw a window of opportunity. They visited his bedside, as they had done with wounded mob figures in other cases, and raised the possibility of cooperation. They could offer protection for him and his family, a chance at a new life under government witness programs, and the prospect of a lesser sentence in exchange for truthful testimony about the Lucchese family's operations. At first, he refused. Even after experiencing the attempt on his life, the hold of the mafia's code remained strong. He had spent his entire adult life operating under the belief that becoming an informant, flipping, in the harsh slang of the street, was the ultimate betrayal. He had watched as earlier turncoats were vilified, their names spoken with disdain in back rooms and prison yards. The idea of placing himself in that category, of helping the government dismantle the same structure that had given him status and income, was too much to accept. His initial rejection of the government's overtures was also rooted in an ingrained sense of hierarchy. For decades, he had been taught that business, inside the family, even when it included violent feuds and betrayals, remained separate from the world of courts and prosecutors. To talk to law enforcement was to cross an invisible but absolute line. Even after being shot, he could tell himself that what had happened was an internal matter, a terrible but somehow contained event that did not justify turning to outsiders. Meanwhile, the Lucchese leadership did not consider the matter closed. The failure of the assassination attempt raised urgent questions among Amuso and Casso and their confidants. They had intended to remove a perceived threat. Instead, they now had a wounded captain in federal custody with every incentive, at least from their perspective, to one day testify against them. In their minds, that risk had to be managed. Under the ruthless logic that governed their decisions, the most effective way to control someone who might talk was not only to target the person himself, but also to demonstrate that his loved ones were within reach. The message they intended to send was brutally simple. Even if he survived, and even if he entered some form of government protection, his family would not be safe if he chose to cooperate. In the summer of 1991, that message began to be delivered. Federal investigators monitoring chatter and informant reports became aware that threats were being directed not just at Peter but at his relatives. In August, those threats turned into action. On Staten Island, Peter's sister was ambushed while sitting in her car. Gunmen opened fire, and she was struck and seriously wounded. She survived, but the attack left her with lasting physical damage and sent a stark signal about the lengths to which the Lucchese leadership was prepared to go. For prosecutors and agents, the assault on his sister confirmed what they had feared. The wariness of Amuso and Casso extended beyond their own members to uninvolved relatives, people who had no role in mafia business, but who could be used as leverage. For Peter, the news was devastating. His decision not to cooperate had been motivated in part by a desire to shield his family from stigma and upheaval. Now he saw that staying silent did not guarantee their safety. In fact, it seemed to place them directly in the line of fire. Agents returned to him with a different argument. Cooperation was no longer framed only as a way to save himself. It was presented as the best, and perhaps the only, means of protecting his extended family from further attacks. They could, they explained, relocate his relatives under protective programs, change their identities, and move them far from the reach of Lucchese gunmen. But they needed his agreement and his testimony to justify such an extraordinary expenditure of resources and to dismantle the organization that was targeting them. The moral equation that had once seemed straightforward, loyalty to the family over cooperation with law enforcement, was now far more complicated. In public testimony later on, Peter would describe how the threats and violence against his sister and other relatives shattered his remaining faith in the organization. The code he had followed all his life claimed to protect family. But here it was, turning its weapons on a woman who had never been part of any criminal enterprise, simply because of her blood relation to him. Sometime in late 1991, confronted with these realities, he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He agreed to become a cooperating witness for the federal government. The shift was momentous, both personally and historically. For the Lucchese family, it meant that one of their most knowledgeable captains, a man deeply involved in construction, labor, and internal affairs, was now prepared to tell prosecutors what he knew. For law enforcement, it represented a breakthrough, confirming that even trusted mid-level leaders could be turned under sufficient pressure. The process of cooperation did not begin with public courtroom appearances. It started in anonymous conference rooms with proffer sessions, intense, often exhausting meetings where Peter, under the guidance of his attorneys, laid out what he knew about the Lucchese family structure, crimes, and key players. Federal agents and prosecutors asked detailed questions: names, dates, locations, the mechanics of schemes like the Windows racket, the internal decision-making that had led to murders, extortions, and other offenses. Their aim was not just to gather stories, but to assemble evidence that could withstand challenges in court. Peter's value lay partly in his long tenure inside the organization. He could trace how leadership had shifted from the Corallo era to the Amuso Caso regime, identify who controlled which rackets, and describe how profits were divided and laundered. He could explain the unwritten rules governing disputes, promotions, and discipline. Crucially, he could speak to the specific actions and conversations that connected leaders like Amuso and Caso to violent acts and ongoing conspiracies. At the same time, federal authorities moved to secure the safety of his relatives. In coordination with the U.S. Marshal Service, they organized the relocation of numerous members of his extended family to undisclosed locations. It was one of the larger such efforts undertaken in connection with a single cooperating witness. Cousins, aunts, uncles, siblings, the web of people who might be targeted simply because of their link to him, were uprooted from New York, given new identities, and placed in communities far from the familiar streets of Brooklyn and Staten Island. This process was disruptive and emotionally wrenching. Many of those relatives had built their lives in New York over decades. They left behind jobs, homes, friends, and often the ethnic and religious communities that had anchored them. Some understood and accepted the necessity. Others resented being forced into exile for crimes they had never committed. But the alternative, a continued existence under the shadow of possible attack, was considered too dangerous after the shooting of Peter's sister. For Peter himself, cooperation meant severing almost all ties with his old life. The man who had once held court in social clubs and on street corners now moved through secure corridors accompanied by marshals and agents. His public appearances were limited and tightly controlled. When he did appear, it was increasingly as a witness in high-profile trials, flanked by court officers, his presence in the courtroom a visible symbol of the mafia's eroding code of silence. Within the underworld, his decision sent shockwaves. Word spread quickly that Fat Pete had flipped. The same men who had once deferred to him as a captain now spoke of him in contemptuous tones, when they spoke of him at all. For leaders like Amuso and Caso, his cooperation was both a personal betrayal and a strategic disaster. He knew too much about too many corners of their empire. The campaign of internal purges and retaliatory attacks they had launched against suspected informants seemed, in hindsight, to have backfired. By targeting his family, they had pushed him from reluctance into full collaboration with their enemies. The wider consequences became clear as prosecutors began to use his testimony in case after case. But even before he took the stand for the first time, his decision marked a turning point in the history of the Lucchese family, and more broadly, of the American mafia. The generation of mobsters who had come of age in the 1960s and 1970s, steeped in the rituals and stories of unbreakable loyalty, were now confronting a new reality. Under the weight of RICO indictments, long sentences, and the willingness of bosses to target their own families, some of them were concluding that there were limits to what the old codes were worth. What had begun for Peter as a series of small choices on Brooklyn streets, whom to run errands for, which doors to knock on, which men to impress, had led him into the upper ranks of a secretive organization and then, violently, out the other side. The ambush on Staten Island and the attack on his sister had forced him to confront the stark truth. The world he had served was ready to destroy everything he valued to protect itself. In choosing to speak, he not only sought protection for his loved ones, he also became a key instrument in dismantling the very structure that had once defined his identity. When Peter Chiodo agreed to cooperate, the transformation in his daily life was immediate and absolute. The man who had once moved freely through Brooklyn social clubs, Staten Island neighborhoods, and Midtown offices now found his movements dictated by federal agents and U.S. Marshals. In the logic of witness protection, there was no halfway measure. The same criminal world that had turned on him and targeted his sister had to be kept at a distance not in miles, but in layers of secrecy, controlled access, and constant vigilance. Physically, his world shrank to secure rooms, escorted transfers, and carefully scheduled meetings. At first, he was held in special units within federal detention facilities, separated from the general prison population whenever possible. For years, he had been used to being the highest-ranking man in most rooms he entered. Now he wore standard-issue clothing, followed orders about when to eat and when to move, and waited for guards to unlock doors. The contrast with his old life could not have been starker. What did not shrink was the space inside his memory. Prosecutors and agents quickly realized that they were dealing with someone who had been at the center of Lukey's operations for over a decade. A captain who had sat in on sensitive meetings, managed multi-million-dollar rackets, and seen the inner workings of the family across changing regimes. They scheduled long proffer sessions, sometimes lasting hours at a time, in which Peter, usually flanked by his attorney, answered detailed questions about his activities and those of his associates. These sessions were part confession, part history lesson, and part forensic reconstruction of crimes that had, until then, been only dim silhouettes on investigative charts. Prosecutors wanted names, relationships, dates, and places. They wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how the system functioned, who controlled which neighborhoods, how disputes were settled, how the family interfaced with unions and contractors, and how orders moved from bosses like Victor Amuso and Anthony Casso down to soldiers on the street. Peter began by laying out the structure as he knew it. He described the hierarchy of the Lukey's family: boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers, and associates, and how that structure had evolved from the days of Tony Dux Corallo to the hard-edged regime of Amuso and Casso. He identified crews and territories, explained which captains handled construction, which oversaw gambling and loan sharking, and which were closer to the family's labor interests. For investigators who had long tried to piece this information together from surveillance and second-hand sources, hearing it explained plainly by a former insider was a breakthrough. He then moved into specifics. On the Windows scheme, the centerpiece of the federal indictment he had originally faced, Peter's knowledge was unusually detailed. He could recount meetings where representatives of different families discussed how to divide contracts for public housing authority work. He identified the window installation companies that were, in reality, controlled by or beholden to various mafia families. He explained how bids were coordinated, how competitors were pressured to stay out of certain markets, and how payments were funneled back to the mob through inflated invoices or direct cash handoffs. To prosecutors, this was the connective tissue they needed to show that the Windows racket was not a series of isolated abuses, but a coherent, multi-family conspiracy. They used his information to refine their trial strategy, corroborate existing evidence, and approach other witnesses with more pointed questions. To juries, when he would eventually testify, these explanations would help transform what might otherwise have seemed like dry, contracting irregularities into a vivid picture of sustained corruption. But the value of his cooperation went far beyond the Windows case. Peter also had direct knowledge of violent crimes, murders and attempted murders, that the Lukey's leadership had ordered in response to perceived threats and betrayals. Chief among these was the attempt on his own life and the later attack on his sister. In private sessions, he recounted his understanding of how those decisions had been made, how his guilty plea in the Windows case had been interpreted by Amus and Casso, how paranoia about potential informants had driven them to consider drastic measures, and how they had extended that logic to his family. He also provided information on earlier acts of internal discipline. By the early 1990s, investigators already suspected that a number of killings within the Lukey's family were linked to fears of cooperation. Peter's testimony helped confirm that pattern. He described the atmosphere of suspicion that had taken hold under Amuso and Casso, the rumors that certain soldiers or associates were talking, and the secret meetings where it was decided that these potential risks should be eliminated rather than confronted or demoted. These disclosures formed part of a much larger mosaic that federal authorities were assembling. They now had multiple insiders from different families, men like Alphonse, Little Al, Darko from the Lukis, and Sammy Gravano from the Gambino, willing to outline how decisions were made, how violence was authorized, and how criminal profits were distributed. Each cooperating witness filled in a different section of the picture. Peter's contribution was central when it came to construction, unions, and the internal workings of the Lukis family in the 1980s and early 1990s. By 1992, this behind-the-scenes work began to surface in public trials. One of the most significant was the federal prosecution of Victor Amuso in the Eastern District of New York. Captured in Pennsylvania in 1991, after a period as a fugitive, Amuso faced RICO charges that included multiple murders, extortion, and racketeering connected to the operation of the Lukis family. The government's case depended heavily on the testimony of former insiders, who could directly link the boss to specific criminal acts and conspiracies. When Peter entered the courtroom as a government witness, it marked a symbolic moment. Just a few years earlier, he had been a loyal captain under the very man now sitting at the defense table. The newspapers seized on the imagery, a massive figure who had survived a near-fatal shooting, now under federal protection, recounting the inner affairs of his former world. Reporters noted how he described, in measured tones, the path that had led him from street-level work to the center of the family's construction rackets, and how that path intersected with the decisions Amuso had made. On the stand, he testified about the structure of the Lukis family, confirming for the jury that Amuso was indeed recognized within the organization as the boss. He explained the flow of money upward from crews like his own, the tributes captains paid, and the understanding that in return they received authority over specific rackets. He shed light on the Windows scheme, making clear that such a large and coordinated operation could not have functioned without approval from the very top. Crucially, he spoke about the climate of fear and the orders that had targeted him and his relatives. He told the court that after he pleaded guilty in the Windows case, word filtered back that the bosses had decided he was a potential liability. The attempt on his life, in his understanding, had been ordered to remove that perceived risk. The subsequent attack on his sister, he testified, had been carried out as part of a campaign to pressure him into silence even as he lay in a hospital bed. These accounts helped prosecutors argue that Amuso was not just an abstract figurehead, but an active leader willing to sanction or condone attacks on his own men and their families. Peter's testimony was corroborated by other cooperating witnesses and by physical evidence the government had gathered through surveillance, wiretaps, and informants. Together, their accounts painted a consistent picture of a boss who signed off on murder plots and extortion schemes as part of maintaining his grip on the organization. In 1992, Amuso was convicted on multiple counts and later sentenced to life imprisonment, a blow from which the Lukis family's leadership structure never fully recovered. For Peter, testifying in that trial meant facing not only his former boss, but also the collective judgment of the criminal world he had left behind. In mafia culture, to appear in court as a government witness was to cross a line from which there was no return. Every word he spoke under oath further distanced him from the man he had been, and deepened the hostility directed at him from former associates. Yet at the same time, each piece of evidence he provided strengthened the case that the organization he once served was not governed by any honorable code, but by self-preservation at any cost. In the years that followed, he would repeat this pattern in other trials. When the Windows case itself finally went before a jury, his testimony again played a pivotal role. This complex prosecution involved multiple defendants from several mafia families, along with contractors and business intermediaries accused of participating in the bid-rigging conspiracy. Juries in such cases often struggled with the abstract nature of financial crimes. The web of contracts, invoices, and corporate entities could feel remote and technical. Peter's presence humanized the scheme, without sanitizing it, by explaining how, in practice, intimidation and collusion translated into higher costs and stifled competition. He described meetings where representatives from different families agreed on how to divide the contracts, the percentage cuts that various figures received, and the way window companies had to conform to expectations if they wanted to keep working. He explained how union officials were steered or pressured into going along, how rival companies were warned off, and how, when necessary, the possibility of violence hung in the air as a tacit threat. His testimony helped jurors see that the scheme was not a victimless manipulation of paper, but a system that siphoned public funds while reinforcing the power of criminal organizations. The outcome of these proceedings was a string of convictions, guilty pleas, and long sentences. Major figures from several families were held accountable, and millions of dollars in fines and forfeitures were imposed. For New York City's public agencies and honest contractors, the dislodging of the windows cartel opened the door to more transparent bidding processes, even if the temptation for corruption never entirely disappeared. For the mafia, the case underscored that the era of quietly controlling large segments of the construction industry, without serious legal repercussions, was ending. Throughout these trials, Peter's life remained tightly circumscribed by security protocols. He was moved discreetly to and from courthouses, often through back entrances and secure corridors, to minimize the risk of an attack. In the courtroom, he typically sat surrounded by marshals or under the watchful eye of security officers. Judges sometimes addressed jurors directly about the presence of these measures, reminding them not to let the visible precautions unduly influence their assessment of his credibility. Outside the courtroom, he lived in locations that were not disclosed to the public, under identities designed to shield him from recognition. The U.S. Marshals Service's Witness Security Program, which had been formalized in the 1970s, was by then an experienced operation, having handled numerous organized crime figures. But each high-profile cooperator presented unique challenges. Peter's distinctive physical presence and the publicity surrounding his survival of the 1991 shooting made anonymity more difficult to maintain than for some others. For his extended family, resettled in scattered locations across the country, the adjustment was often painful. They had traded the familiar rhythms of New York's Italian-American neighborhoods for towns and cities where they had no roots and where their pasts had to be kept hidden. Some struggled with isolation and the loss of their support networks. Others tried to build new lives, finding work, enrolling children in school, and forging new community ties, all under the shadow of a story they could not fully share with neighbors or coworkers. The justice system, for its part, had to wrestle with the moral complexity of relying on men like Peter as witnesses. Judges were candid in their instructions to juries. Cooperating witnesses were themselves admitted criminals, often participants in the very acts for which others were being tried. Their testimony had to be weighed carefully, considered alongside corroborating evidence, and not taken at face value simply because they were now aligned with the prosecution. Defense attorneys cross-examined Peter vigorously, highlighting his criminal record and suggesting that he had strong incentives to shape his account in ways that would please the government and secure more lenient treatment for himself. Peter did receive benefits for his cooperation. Prosecutors filed motions on his behalf that acknowledged the value of his testimony, and judges took these into account in sentencing. Yet it would be misleading to suggest that cooperation granted him an easy life. He traded the prospect of an extended prison sentence in the open for a shorter or more flexible term entwined with strict supervision, constant movement, and the lasting loss of his old identity. unlike a fictional narrative where a character can simply start over. His days were circumscribed by the knowledge that there were still people in the world who might be willing to harm him if they ever discovered where he was. From a historical perspective, his decision to cooperate and testify marked another step in the disintegration of the mafia's long-standing code of silence. In the 1950s and 1960s, the idea that a made member, a sworn-in soldier or captain, would publicly testify against his own boss was almost unthinkable. By the 1990s, a combination of factors had made such choices more common. RICO's sweeping reach, the length of potential sentences, improved witness protection capabilities, and the increasingly ruthless behavior of certain leaders toward their own men and families. Peter's story intersected directly with that last factor. The attempt on his life was shocking enough. The attack on his sister and the broader threats to his relatives were perceived by many observers as a particularly stark illustration of how far Amuso and Casso were willing to go. When Peter later described these events in court, they served not only as evidence in specific cases, but as a kind of indictment of the entire culture that had allowed such decisions to seem rational within the leadership circle. By the mid-1990s, the cumulative effect of his testimony and that of other cooperators had left the Lucchese family's upper structure severely damaged. Its boss was serving life in prison. Its former underboss, Anthony Casso, had been captured in 1993 and later pleaded guilty to a sweeping array of charges, including his role in multiple murders and racketeering schemes. His own attempt at cooperation with the government ultimately collapsed amid allegations that he had concealed ongoing misconduct, leaving him incarcerated for the rest of his life. Several captains and key soldiers were behind bars, and the family's influence over major municipal contracts had been significantly curtailed. None of this meant that organized crime vanished overnight. The Lucchese family, like its counterparts in the other 4 major New York families, adapted. New leaders emerged, sometimes from lower ranks, trying to revive old rackets or shift into new ones less obviously tied to traditional industries like construction. But the environment they operated in was fundamentally changed. Prosecutors had a clearer map of the organization, and the knowledge that insiders like Peter could, under pressure, be persuaded to testify hung over every decision. For Peter himself, the public phase of his cooperation, those years of back-to-back trials, courtroom appearances, and media attention, gradually gave way to a more obscured existence. Once the major cases in which he was a central witness had run their course, his name appeared less frequently in headlines. He receded into the protective shell of the witness program, where the day-to-day challenges were no longer about facing former comrades across a courtroom, but about building a sustainable existence in the shadow of a past that could never fully be put away. Yet even in that relative obscurity, his impact continued to ripple through the institutions and communities he had once influenced from the other side of the law. Contractors who had previously regarded mob influence as an unavoidable cost of doing business now faced greater scrutiny, and in many cases, a changed set of incentives. Union locals that had quietly tolerated or actively cooperated with extortion had to reevaluate their internal controls as federal monitors and reform measures took hold. The public agencies responsible for housing and infrastructure, chastened by scandal, instituted stricter oversight of bidding processes and vendor relationships. In the historical record, the arc of his life up to that point traced the larger story of the American mafia in the post-war era. Rise from tight-knit immigrant neighborhoods into sophisticated control of major industries, consolidation of power under bosses who saw themselves as untouchable, followed by a reckoning brought on by new legal tools and a wave of internal defections. Peter had lived each phase from the inside, then helped prosecutors narrate it in open court. What remained was the long aftermath. The years in which he would have to live with the consequences of choices made in both worlds, criminal and legal, and the question of how a man so thoroughly shaped by one culture could adapt to life under its protection, but outside its embrace. In the second half of the 1990s, as the headlines about spectacular mob trials began to thin out, the real work of dismantling the systems those cases had exposed continued in quieter courtrooms and bureaucratic offices. Peter Chiodo, whose dramatic shooting and decision to cooperate had been front-page material just a few years earlier, now operated largely out of sight. Yet his voice still echoed in legal proceedings, transcripts, and investigative memos, shaping how prosecutors, judges, and regulators understood the inner workings of organized crime in New York. The major trials in which he played a central role, the prosecution of boss Vittorio Amuso, the Windows corruption case, and related racketeering prosecutions, did not simply end with verdicts. They triggered a series of sentencing hearings, plea negotiations, and follow-up investigations. In each of these, the government relied in part on what it had learned from him. Agents who had spent hours across a table from Peter now used his explanations to interpret new surveillance tapes and financial records. Lawyers unfamiliar with the culture of the mafia read his testimony as a sort of primer on how a modern crime family operated behind its carefully maintained facade. One of the areas where his cooperation had the most lasting systemic impact was the intersection of organized crime and the construction trades. The Windows case made it impossible to ignore how deeply 4 of New York's 5 major mafia families had penetrated public contracting. Federal and city officials responded by tightening bidding procedures, imposing compliance programs, and in some cases, installing outside monitors to oversee unions and contractors previously identified as vulnerable to mob influence. The details Peter had supplied about how bids were allocated, which firms were with which family, and how money moved between them, gave reformers a concrete list of practices to look for and disrupt. For example, he had described how ostensibly independent window companies were, in reality, subservient to family interests, which were effectively Lucchi's fronts, which leaned toward the Genovese or Gambino families, and how the Colombos fit into the cartel. He explained the unwritten rules, that one company would intentionally submit a higher bid to make sure an agreed-upon firm won, that union stewards would quietly steer work crews in line with mob preferences, that job delays or minor acts of sabotage could be used as leverage against uncooperative contractors. These patterns, once invisible to an outsider, became red flags that investigators and auditors could recognize. At the same time, Peter's knowledge of specific violent episodes continued to be relevant. Even after the main cases against Amuso and key captains concluded, there remained unsolved murders and attempted murders linked to the Lucchi's family during the turbulent years when paranoia over informants was high. Prosecutors revisited some of these files with Peter's statements in hand, cross-checking his account against ballistics reports, telephone records, and other witness testimony. In some instances, his information helped solidify theories about motive and authorization. In others, it confirmed that certain killings had been ordered from the top as part of a broader campaign to eliminate suspected cooperators. Within the justice system, his cooperation prompted uncomfortable but necessary conversations about how to treat men who had spent years committing serious crimes, but were now helping dismantle the networks that had enabled those crimes. Federal sentencing guidelines allowed departures, reductions from the otherwise applicable sentencing range, when defendants provided substantial assistance to the government. Prosecutors filed such motions on Peter's behalf, outlining in sealed and public submissions the breadth of his cooperation, the number of proffer sessions he had participated in, the trials at which he had testified, the investigations that had been opened or strengthened because of his information. When he finally appeared for his own sentencing in federal court, The scene bore little resemblance to the image of a defiant mobster, refusing to acknowledge the authority of the law. Years had passed since the day he was shot outside the Staten Island auto shop. In those years, he had seen his former boss condemned to life imprisonment, watched as other high-ranking figures pleaded guilty in the face of overwhelming evidence, and testified about the attempt on his sister's life and the relocation of his extended family. His attorneys emphasized his cooperation, his injuries, and the extraordinary disruption to his and his relatives' lives. The government, while not minimizing the seriousness of his crimes, supported a substantial reduction from the sentence he would otherwise have faced. The judge had to balance competing imperatives. On one hand was the need to hold him accountable for years of racketeering, extortion, bid rigging, and participation in a criminal enterprise that had used the threat of violence to control major segments of the city's economy. On the other was the undeniable fact that his testimony had contributed to convictions of higher-ranking figures and had shed rare light on systemic corruption. The resulting sentence, though still significant, was far lighter than the decades he had once stood to receive. It reflected a judicial calculation that society's broader interest in dismantling entrenched criminal organizations justified leniency for those who, even belatedly, chose to help. By then, the price he and his family had paid could not be measured solely in years of custody. The physical scars from the 1991 shooting remained, a permanent reminder of the morning when his own colleagues had tried to end his life. He had lived under constant security, his movements dictated by marshals and agents. Relatives who had once lived within walking distance of one another in Brooklyn and Staten Island were now scattered under assumed names. Cultural patterns that had anchored them, parish communities, local shops, familiar faces, had been replaced by anonymity. For some in his extended family, the protective program offered real safety and new opportunities. Children grew up in places where their last name no longer carried unspoken connotations, and where their futures were not circumscribed by their proximity to someone else's criminal choices. For others, the relocation felt like an unending exile. They had done nothing wrong, yet they bore the day-to-day consequences of his past. Historians and journalists who later looked at the case often remarked on the scale of this collateral dislocation. Few cooperating witnesses had required such a broad net of protection. Beyond his immediate story, the broader landscape of organized crime was rapidly changing. The commission case of the mid-1980s, the Windows prosecution, and successive racketeering trials had decimated the overt control that New York's mafia families once exercised over unions and key industries. Veterans of organized crime units in the FBI and U.S. attorneys' offices noted that by the late 1990s, labor racketeering, a central pillar of mob power since at least the 1930s, was under more pressure than at any time in living memory. Loan sharking and gambling continued. Drug trafficking remained a serious issue, but the quiet, bureaucratic domination of procurement offices and labor locals was harder to sustain under the new level of scrutiny. Peter's testimony contributed to this shift, not only in specific cases, but also in the way it influenced official attitudes. Regulators and inspectors who had once regarded union and contractor corruption as an intractable, almost cultural issue now had concrete blueprints of how it worked and who benefited. They understood, for example, that a simple pattern of chronically inflated bids on public housing repairs might not be mere inefficiency, but could signal a deeper criminal arrangement. The diagrams of family trees on office walls were gradually updated with more accurate information about roles and relationships, some of it drawn directly from what Peter and other cooperators had explained. Inside the Lukey's family, the repercussions of his defection were profound. Trust, always a fragile commodity in criminal organizations, became even more scarce. Surviving leaders and rising figures knew that a man who had once been a captain, a man trusted with major rackets and sensitive decisions, had ultimately chosen to describe their methods to the government in excruciating detail. This awareness fed a cycle of caution and at times paralysis. Ambitious schemes requiring cooperation across crews or families seemed riskier when any participant might one day sit in a witness chair and recount every planning session. The late 1990s also saw a subtle but important shift in how the public perceived the mafia. The myth of unbreakable loyalty, already fraying in the wake of earlier defections, was increasingly hard to sustain in the face of high-profile cooperators like Peter. Books, articles, and televised reports cited his case as part of a pattern. Men who had been formally inducted into crime families, who had taken oaths of secrecy and loyalty, choosing, under extreme pressure, to assist prosecutors. This did not mean that everyone in those circles became an informant. Many did not. But the idea that membership guaranteed silence was clearly no longer true. Within law enforcement, some investigators noted that the very brutality of the Caso regime had inadvertently encouraged more cooperation. By targeting the families of suspected informants, they had violated an older, if unevenly observed, boundary about who was considered fair game. Cooperators like Peter underscored this point in their testimony, making it clear that these attacks had been a factor in their decisions. The message, both to judges and to potential future informants, was stark. If bosses were willing to endanger non-criminal relatives, then the moral calculus that once underpinned the code of silence had changed. Peter's cooperation also intersected, indirectly, with the unraveling of Anthony Caso's own attempt to work with the government. Caso, captured in 1993, initially provided extensive information about murders, corruption, and even allegations of law enforcement officials on the mob's payroll. But his cooperation was ultimately terminated when authorities concluded he had been untruthful and had continued to engage in wrongdoing while supposedly under their protection. In the years that followed, Caso publicly criticized former associates who had testified against him, including Peter. From his own secure locations, Peter, when asked in court about Caso, stuck to specific recollections. Conversations in which Caso had boasted about violent acts, expressed suspicion of various members, or described the Windows racket in terms that underscored his direct involvement. These intersecting stories, Amuso's conviction, Caso's failed cooperation, and Peter's continuing role as a witness, highlighted something central about the era: the collapse of a long-standing insularity at the top levels of the mafia. Once, internal feuds and betrayals had played out entirely within the shadows, invisible to the judicial system except as unexplained bursts of violence. Now, those same feuds were being parsed in court transcripts, with participants offering their versions under oath. For Peter personally, life after sentencing settled into a constrained routine. Even when not physically behind bars, he remained under close supervision. The witness security program did not simply drop former cooperators into new cities and leave them to their own devices. There were regular check-ins with marshals, rules about contact with the past, and ongoing restrictions intended to reduce the risk of retaliation or reoffending. For a man who had spent most of his adult life at the center of a complex social and criminal network, this imposed isolation could be both a relief and a strain. He no longer woke each day to a stream of men seeking favors, arbitration of disputes, or permission to pursue some illicit venture. There were no tribute payments to collect, no late-night calls about a stalled truck or an angry union steward. Instead, there were ordinary obligations: finding ways to support himself within the rules of the program, managing health issues, maintaining the precautions necessary to avoid accidental recognition. His size and distinctive appearance, often noted in press coverage during the trials, made blending into a crowd more challenging than it might have been for other cooperators. Occasionally, the past intruded despite all precautions. News stories about new Lukey's indictments or about shifts in organized crime in New York would refer back to earlier cases, sometimes mentioning his name as one of the pivotal cooperators of the 1990s. Academic studies and long-form journalism on the decline of the traditional mafia frequently cited the Windows case and the Amuso prosecution as watershed moments, and with them, his role. For people in his new surroundings who had no reason to associate the quiet, aging man in their midst with those distant events, these references passed unnoticed. But for him, they were reminders that the life he had left behind remained a subject of public curiosity and historical analysis. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods where he had grown up and first made his reputation were changing. Brooklyn's Italian enclaves, already evolving in the 1970s and 1980s, were in the midst of deeper demographic and economic shifts. Gentrification was altering property values and bringing in new residents unfamiliar with the old patterns of social control. Staten Island, where he had once walked confidently into the auto shop where he was ambushed, continued to grow and diversify. Some of the social clubs and businesses that had served as informal headquarters for Lukey's crews closed or reinvented themselves under new management. Law enforcement veterans would later argue that the combined effect of demographic change, new legal tools, and insider cooperation had fundamentally altered the environment in which crime families operated. The kind of multi-decade, semi-open influence that Peter and his contemporaries had exercised over construction, and labor was no longer viable in the same way. Smaller-scale schemes persisted. The impulse to extract illicit profit from public and private projects did not disappear, but the overt, structured supervision of entire sectors by named families came under sustained challenge. Looking back across that decade of upheaval, from the early 1990s to the turn of the millennium, Peter's life traced a stark arc. He had entered the period as a trusted captain, managing lucrative rackets and participating in leadership decisions inside one of New York's most powerful crime families. He had survived an assassination attempt ordered from within that same organization, watched it extend its reach to his closest relatives, and ultimately chosen to help the government dismantle large portions of its structure. He had stood in courtrooms and described, with the authority of first-hand experience, how the mafia's grip on construction, unions, and even its own members had operated. In doing so, he became part of a broader historical shift, from an era when organized crime's internal workings were a matter of speculation and rumor to one in which those workings were documented in sworn testimony, court exhibits, and public reports. The closed world that had shaped him as a young man in post-war Brooklyn was no longer closed in the same way. Its rituals, hierarchies, and informal rules had been translated into the language of indictments and judicial opinions. And while that translation came at a personal cost, he and his family would continue to bear. It also played a role in loosening the hold that World had long exercised over the city he once helped control from the shadows. By the early 2000s, the frantic pace of indictments and marquee trials that had dominated Peter Chiodo's life in the first half of the 1990s had slowed. The most powerful men in his former world were already serving long sentences. The sprawling Windows case had run its course. The Lukey's boss he once answered to, Vittorio Amuso, had been convicted and consigned to a federal penitentiary for the remainder of his life. For the public, the story seemed to have moved on. But in the machinery of the justice system, his cooperation still had a long tail, and his name continued to surface in ways that he himself would likely never fully see. Appeals in the big racketeering cases generated hundreds of pages of legal reasoning. Defense lawyers challenged the sufficiency of the evidence, the interpretation of RICO, the use of cooperating witnesses whom they argued had every incentive to embellish, and even the length of the sentences imposed. In opinion after opinion, judges compared the trial records against those claims. When they cited testimony from insiders to explain why juries had been entitled to believe the government's narrative about how the Lukey's family and its allies operated, Peter's name often appeared among them. In some cases, his testimony was quoted directly. His descriptions of the Windows cartel, his explanation of how construction firms were told which jobs they could and could not bid on, his account of the conversations that convinced him the attempt on his life had been sanctioned by the leadership. In others, he appeared as one of several cooperating witnesses whose accounts were summarized together as establishing key facts. The legal language was dry, but it captured how deeply his version of events had been woven into the judicial record. Meanwhile, prosecutors used what they had, learned from him in new investigations that only gradually came to light. Construction and union racketeering had not vanished with the convictions of the 1990s. The money at stake remained too great. But the playbook organized crime groups had used for decades was now more transparent to law enforcement. Investigators examining fresh allegations of corruption in the building trades routinely asked whether the methods they were seeing, shell companies, artificially high bids, a small cluster of firms dominating particular contracts, resembled the patterns Peter and other insiders had described. Sometimes their answer was yes. Earlier schemes had left traces. Companies that had survived the Windows case under new management, but whose ties to old networks still raised questions. Union locals that had been reformed on paper, but where old habits lingered. In these contexts, Peter's debriefings, recorded and indexed in federal files, functioned as a guide to where leverage might exist, which relationship patterns might be suspect, and how seemingly independent actors might in fact be operating under unspoken obligations. Within the Lukes family, the aftershocks of his cooperation continued. New defendants arrested in the late 1990s and early 2000s, whether for gambling, loan sharking, or the remnants of labor racketeering, faced prosecutors who could lay out the family's structure and history with a clarity that earlier generations of law enforcement had lacked. When these newer cases went to trial, the government did not always need to call Peter himself. Often, it was enough to introduce transcripts and prior testimony, or to present charts and summaries that had been built on the foundation of earlier cooperators' statements. Defense attorneys, aware of how damaging insider testimony had been in previous trials, sometimes tried a different tack. They argued that the old cases, with their tales of bid rigging, window cartels, and internal death sentences, belonged to a different era. The men now in the dock, they suggested, were peripheral players or part of a diminished organization. But the very fact that they had to draw that distinction underscored how thoroughly the story of the old regime, Amuso, Casso, and captains like Peter, had become a benchmark against which later activity was measured. For their part, federal agencies treated the lessons of the 1990s as institutional knowledge. Training sessions for new organized crime investigators used the Windows case and related prosecutions as case studies. Young agents were told how years of patient surveillance had finally intersected with the decision of insiders like Peter to cooperate. They listened to excerpts from wiretaps and then read his explanations of the coded language, the nicknames, the seemingly innocuous phrases that in fact signaled threats, payments, or orders. His words, taken from sterile interview rooms, thus filtered into PowerPoint slides and training manuals, part of a continuing effort to ensure that the next generation would not have to relearn hard-won insights from scratch. In parallel, academics and journalists delving into the history of organized crime in New York began to give his story more attention. Books that trace the arc of the Lukes family from its mid-century roots through its late 20th century transformation devoted sections to the Windows racket and the internal purge that had ended with the attempt on his life. Writers pored over trial transcripts and court filings, reconstructing from his sworn testimony how the family had balanced profit and discipline, how it had navigated its relationships with other families, and how the leadership's decision to target relatives had destroyed whatever remained of its internal mystique. For readers outside legal and law enforcement circles, these accounts brought back into focus an event that, by then, was more than a decade old. A captain ambushed in broad daylight on Staten Island, riddled with bullets and yet surviving. A sister nearly killed in a car as part of a campaign to enforce silence. And the spectacle of a once-feared mobster appearing on the witness stand across from his former boss. In the retelling, the details varied, but the core point remained. The episode had exposed, with unusual clarity, the inner contradictions of a criminal culture that prided itself on honor, while repeatedly sacrificing its own in the name of self-preservation. During these same years, Peter's own day-to-day existence moved further away from that violent, public crossroads. The formal phase of his cooperation, for which he was shuttled regularly between secure locations and federal courthouses, drew to a close as the major cases on which he had direct, first-hand information wrapped up. His obligations to testify did not vanish entirely. In the American system, witnesses can be recalled for retrials or related proceedings. But the intense, almost continuous rotation from one trial to another that had defined the early 1990s for him gradually subsided. What replaced it was an extended, less visible adaptation to life under protection. The witness security program is designed first and foremost to keep people alive, not to provide them with comfort or a sense of emotional closure. For cooperators who had joined the program at a relatively young age or before they had risen high in criminal hierarchies, its conditions could be demanding, but also offered a straightforward trade: physical safety and a chance at a lawful life in exchange for abiding by strict rules. For someone like Peter, who entered protection after decades of wielding power as a captain, the transition was more jarring. In his old life, he had been surrounded by people whose time and attention he could command: soldiers expecting orders, associates seeking favors, business owners anxious to stay in his good graces. Decisions flowed out from him to others. In the witness program, the flow was reversed. Federal marshals told him when and how he could move, what contact with the outside world was permissible, and how to handle any situation in which his past might be accidentally revealed. His phone and mail were subject to oversight. Where he lived and under what name were not questions of personal preference, but matters settled in consultation with security officials. Publicly available information about the specifics of his later life is intentionally sparse. The effectiveness of such protection depends, in part, on maintaining that opacity. What is known is that he remained under federal protection well after his courtroom appearances tapered off, and that officials saw his case as one requiring long-term vigilance. The attack on his sister had demonstrated that the threat to his extended family was not hypothetical. Even as the old leadership aged in prison and newer figures took over, no one in charge of witness security was willing to assume that the risk had vanished entirely. For his relatives, who had been transported out of New York and resettled across the country, the early 2000s were years of gradual reconstruction. Children who had been moved as youngsters grew into adolescence and adulthood in communities where their neighbors knew nothing of their connection to the Lukey's family or the dramas of the early 1990s. They were free, in a way, to write their own stories. Yet for older family members, the sense of dislocation could remain acute. They followed news from New York from a distance, recognizing street names and boroughs in crime stories that now seemed to come from another lifetime. On the other side of that divide, many of the places and institutions that had formed the background of Peter's youth and criminal career were changing. The social clubs that had once acted as semi-public headquarters for organized crime figures in Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan were subject to greater police scrutiny, zoning changes, and in some cases, outright closure. Some were converted into restaurants, cafes, or other legitimate businesses. Others simply disappeared. New residents, drawn by real estate prices and changing neighborhood reputations, moved into areas that had once been firmly associated with particular ethnic groups and the criminal networks embedded among them. Former law enforcement officials sometimes pointed to this demographic churn as one of several reasons for the declining visibility of traditional organized crime. The children and grandchildren of the immigrant generation that had supplied much of the mafia's early manpower were, by the 2000s, more likely to be in college or professional fields than in union halls or corner bars where crews once recruited. The economic niches that had made labor and construction racketeering so lucrative, rigidly controlled unions, opaque contracting systems, were somewhat altered, if not entirely reformed, by decades of investigation and oversight. In this context, Peter's life story, already the subject of courtroom recitations and media reconstructions, increasingly took on the character of a cautionary tale from a fading era. Criminologists and sociologists pointed to his trajectory as an example of how neighborhood-based loyalties and economic pressures had drawn young men in the post-war decades into organized crime, and how the same organizations that promised protection and community could turn, unpredictably and violently, on their own. His eventual cooperation, they argued, was less a simple betrayal than a sign of the deep erosion of those internal bonds. Still, the debate over how to judge men like him, who had spent years committing serious offenses and then provided indispensable help to law enforcement, remained unresolved. Some victims of extortion and corruption saw his reduced sentence and protected status as a bitter pill. They had, after all, paid the price for his earlier life in inflated costs, intimidation, and in some cases, fear for their physical safety. From that perspective, no amount of testimony could fully balance the scales. Others, particularly within the justice system, emphasized the practical reality. Without insiders like Peter, many of the most entrenched and harmful rackets would likely have continued unchecked. These debates found occasional echo in judicial commentary. In sentencing other cooperators, judges sometimes referred back to earlier cases, including his, as examples of how cooperation could both serve the public interest and complicate the effort to calibrate punishment. The written decisions in such cases rarely named him outright, but legal scholars parsing the history of organized crime prosecutions could trace the patterns. High-ranking insiders receiving significant sentence reductions in recognition of help that had led to the dismantling of broader criminal structures. By the mid-2000s, the Lucchese family itself looked very different from the version Peter had known as a captain. Its boss and former underboss were locked away. Some of its most experienced captains were dead, imprisoned, or retired. New leadership constellations emerged, often more cautious, more fragmented, and less able to command the kind of cross-industry control that had once made the family a central player in New York's underworld economy. When law enforcement brought new racketeering cases against Lucchese members during this period, the schemes described tended to be smaller in scale, focused on gambling, drugs, or comparatively limited frauds, rather than citywide construction cartels. Yet the echo of the old days remained. In wiretaps and informant reports cited in these later cases, defendants occasionally referenced the purges of the early 1990s and the cooperators who had come out of them. Names like Fat Pete appeared as cautionary signals in conversations, reminders of what could happen when leadership turned inward with suspicion, or when a once loyal insider decided that the costs of silence had become unbearable. To the younger men on those tapes, the stories were already history, something learned secondhand. To prosecutors who read the transcripts, they were evidence that the memory of that upheaval still shaped behavior a decade later. From the vantage point of the present, with more time and distance separating us from the events that nearly ended Peter's life on that Staten Island morning, it is easier to see how his individual choices intersected with broader historical currents. He came of age in an era when the American mafia's influence, while often hidden from public view, was woven deeply into the economic and social fabric of certain neighborhoods and industries. He rose within an organization that presented itself, at least internally, as a source of order and protection in a chaotic urban landscape. He participated in schemes that blurred the line between legitimate business and criminal exploitation so thoroughly that many participants justified them as simply a rougher version of how the world worked. Then the context shifted. New laws changed the risk calculus. Investigative techniques advanced. Prosecutors became more adept at using insiders and building long, complex cases. And leadership within his own family adopted methods that eroded whatever residual sense of mutual obligation might have restrained its harshest impulses. When that leadership chose to address perceived disloyalty, not only by targeting the alleged offenders but also by attacking uninvolved relatives, it crossed a threshold that men like Peter had to confront. His subsequent cooperation was shaped by all these factors: legal pressure, fear, anger, pragmatic concern for his family, and a dawning recognition that the institution he had served would not, in the end, protect him or his own. The courts, law enforcement, and the public would interpret that decision through their own lenses, some focusing on the crimes he committed before he turned witness, others on the criminals he helped bring to justice after. But whatever judgment one applies, it is clear that his story cannot be disentangled from the transformations that overtook both organized crime and its opponents during the final decades of the 20th century and the first of the 21st. In the sealed records of the witness protection system, there is likely a file that tracks his movements, health, and periodic contacts with supervising officials in the years since the high-profile trials ended, a quiet counterpoint to the thick, public court files that document the earlier, more visible phases of his life. Those sealed pages are unlikely ever to be fully opened to historians. The visible chapter of his story, the one written in bullet wounds, indictments, trial transcripts, and news reports, is effectively closed. What remains is its imprint, on the law, on the underworld he once served, and on the city whose hidden economies he helped both exploit and later expose. As the first decade of the 21st century advanced, the world that had produced and sustained Peter Chiodo seemed increasingly distant. The familiar names of the old bosses still appeared in legal documents and retrospectives: Corallo, Amuso, Casso. But in active investigations, agents were pursuing different faces, different schemes, often on a smaller scale. Yet if Peter himself had largely vanished into the careful anonymity of federal protection, the footprint of what he had done remained visible in places where most people never looked: appellate rulings, case citations, policy reports, and the internal training materials of law enforcement agencies. In the 2010s, new racketeering indictments against members of the Lucchese family and other New York crime groups continued to surface periodically. They described operations in sports betting, internet gambling, drug trafficking, credit card fraud, and smaller pockets of labor corruption. When prosecutors laid out the history and characteristics of the organizations they were targeting, they often began with a brief sketch of what those families had been at their height. For the Lucchese family, that sketch almost always included the construction rackets of the 1970s and 1980s, the commission case, the windows scheme, and the violent crackdown on suspected informants that had culminated in the attempt on Peter's life. Even when his name did not appear, his testimony underpinned that narrative. The government no longer needed to prove from scratch that the Lucchese family was a structured, hierarchical criminal enterprise. Courts had accepted that characterization in a long line of cases stretching back to the 1980s. Peter's detailed descriptions of the family's internal workings in those earlier trials had been part of the foundation on which that legal consensus rested. When judges in later decades referred to the Lucchese organization as a RICO enterprise, they did so with the benefit of insider accounts like his that had already been tested through cross-examination and jury verdicts. Scholars examining these developments often highlighted a feature that would have been almost unimaginable when Peter first entered the life in the late 1960s. By the early 21st century, the concept of a mob insider taking the stand against his own boss was no longer extraordinary. It had become, if not routine, at least familiar. The roster was long. Former Gambino underboss Salvatore Gravano, Lucchi's acting boss Alphonse Darko, Genovese capo Vincent Fish Caffaro, Banano boss Joseph Massino, among others. Each had his own path into cooperation. Each brought different strengths and limitations as a witness. Peter's case stood out because he combined a central role in a major economic conspiracy with a very personal experience of internal violence directed at his family. Writers who tried to make sense of this wave of defections often framed it as the collapse of an old ethic, omerta, under the pressure of new conditions. That picture, though, was incomplete without acknowledging what men like Peter had seen from the inside. In his account, the code of silence did not simply erode under external legal pressure. It was actively undermined by leaders who had abandoned the reciprocal obligations that once lent that code its limited moral legitimacy among members. When bosses ordered attacks on the relatives of their own captains, they sent a message. The organization would not observe traditional boundaries if it felt threatened. For someone in Peter's position, that realization was central to his eventual choice. At the same time, the government's increasing reliance on high-ranking cooperators generated its own controversies. Defense attorneys, civil libertarians, and some academics argued that giving substantial sentence reductions, and sometimes witness protection benefits, to men deeply involved in serious crimes posed difficult questions about fairness. Peter's case was frequently invoked in this context, not because his outcomes were uniquely lenient or harsh, but because they so clearly illustrated the trade-offs at stake. He had been, by his own admission, a participant in extended racketeering activity, enforcing extortion demands, overseeing bid-rigging schemes that inflated costs on public projects, and operating inside a structure that used intimidation and selective violence as tools of business. For that, he received a sentence far shorter than if he had gone to trial alongside his co-defendants and refused to cooperate. Critics pointed to that disparity as evidence that the system sometimes allowed major offenders to escape full accountability if they were well positioned to help prosecutors. Those who defended the use of insider witnesses responded that such trade-offs were unavoidable if the state hoped to dismantle entrenched criminal systems rather than simply punish a few visible participants. Without cooperators like Peter, they argued, the full scale of the Windows conspiracy might never have been exposed, and bosses like Amuse would likely have remained far more insulated from direct legal responsibility. The law had limited tools for reaching people who orchestrated crimes without appearing on the street to carry them out. Insider testimony, in combination with surveillance and documents, was one of the few. Judges wrestled with these questions in written opinions that referenced earlier cases in abstract terms. They spoke of substantial assistance, cooperating defendants, and criminal enterprises, with citations to trial transcripts and sentencing memos rather than names and faces. But behind those formulaic phrases lay real stories, including Peter's. The decision to reduce his sentence had not been taken lightly. It had been made in the shadow of the extensive cooperation he had provided, the danger to his family, and the government's determination to use his information to prevent future crimes. Outside the legal world, his story continued to circulate in a different form. As part of the growing true crime genre that, by the 2010s, encompassed books, documentaries, long-form articles, and online forums. Investigative journalists revisiting the decline of the traditional New York mafia turned repeatedly to the Windows conspiracy and the internal violence that followed it as a turning point. The image of a large, middle-aged captain slipping into an auto shop on what he thought was an ordinary morning, only to be ambushed by his own side, retained its grim power. In these narratives, his decision to cooperate was often framed as a breaking point moment, a dramatic personal turning that stood in for the broader unraveling of the old ways. The risk in such storytelling was always simplification. Peter's choice had not happened in a single instant. It had unfolded over months, under intense pressure, through repeated conversations with agents and prosecutors, and in the aftermath of the shocking attack on his sister. It also rested on decades of lived experience in an organization whose contradictions he had long accommodated or rationalized before they finally became untenable. Serious historians try to draw out those complexities. They noted that in some ways, Peter remained a man of his generation even in cooperation. He did not present himself as an innocent bystander dragged into crime. He acknowledged his role as a participant and beneficiary. When describing his past, he tended to speak in the pragmatic language of deals, obligations, and consequences rather than grand ideologies. His eventual conclusion, that the Lukey's leadership's willingness to target his family had severed the last thread of loyalty he felt, was delivered not as a sweeping denunciation of the mafia as inherently dishonorable, but as an indictment of specific decisions made by specific men. At the level of the city's institutions, the repercussions of the cases he had influenced were still being worked through well into the 2010s. The New York City Housing Authority, whose contracts had provided the fertile ground for the Windows cartel, continued to face criticism for mismanagement and inefficiency, but it was no longer possible to ignore the risk of organized crime infiltration in the same way. Procurement procedures had been revised, oversight mechanisms strengthened, and external monitors or inspectors general assigned new powers. Some of these reforms would likely have come eventually. Scandals in other areas had already pushed municipal agencies toward greater transparency. Yet the vividness of the Windows case, complete with the human drama of figures like Peter, helped galvanize attention. In the construction and union sectors more broadly, the cultural norms that had once made quiet accommodation with the mob seem acceptable to many participants were under challenge. Younger officials and contractors, shaped by a different era of enforcement and professional ethics, were less likely to see bribe payments or labor peace arrangements as just another cost of doing business. This did not mean that corruption was eliminated, far from it, but it meant that the atmosphere of fatalism that had surrounded mob influence in the mid-20th century had weakened. Retired FBI agents and prosecutors who had worked alongside Peter during the height of his cooperation sometimes reflected, in interviews and memoirs, on the personal dimension of dealing with someone like him. They described the dissonance of spending long hours in a room with a man who was, by all objective measures, dangerous and deeply compromised by his past, yet who was now also a key ally in their efforts to hold more powerful figures accountable. Some were candid about the ambivalence that lingered, respect for his courage in breaking with his old life, tempered by an awareness that he had spent many years contributing to the very harms they were trying to undo. From Peter's side, much of that relationship building necessarily remained off the record. Cooperating witnesses, particularly those placed in long-term protection, rarely have a public platform from which to narrate their own evolution. Their words appear instead in the transcripts of proffer sessions and courtroom testimony, where questions are tightly focused on factual matters. On the page, he is mostly present as a source of information, a man who can recall the date of a meeting, the chain of command behind an order, or the subtle threat embedded in a seemingly casual remark from a boss. That constrained portrait leaves out an inevitable dimension of his later life, the internal work of reconciling his past with his present. Observers who have studied other long-term cooperators note that adaptation to a protected existence often involves an uneasy mixture of remorse, rationalization, and pragmatic focus on survival. Some attempt privately to distance themselves from their former identities, Others continue to feel a complicated pride in aspects of the world they left behind, even as they condemn its actions. In Peter's case, the public record offers only glimpses of such reflections, mostly when he spoke in court about why the attacks on his family had changed his calculus. That moment of explanation, when he told jurors that the decision to target his sister convinced him that there was nothing left to be loyal to, has echoed in later discussions of mafia culture. It cut through romanticized notions of men of honor by centering the experience of someone who had been both an enforcer and, ultimately, a target of the very system he once helped uphold. For law enforcement officials seeking to persuade other insiders to come forward, stories like his became cautionary examples, evidence that silence was no guarantee of safety when leadership grew desperate. At the same time, community advocates working in the neighborhoods where the mafia had historically drawn much of its manpower pointed to cases like Peter as reminders of the heavy costs of criminal involvement, costs that extended far beyond prison and legal fees. Families uprooted, relatives injured or threatened, lifelong relationships destroyed. These were not abstract harms. They were the lived consequences of a culture that demanded absolute loyalty, while offering no real security in return. From the vantage point of those neighborhoods, Peter's life charted a path many parents feared for their children in the 1960s and 1970s. A son of a tight-knit Italian-American community drawn into organized crime, rising through its ranks, and then paying a steep price when the system he helped sustain turned on him. By the 2000s and 2010s, the social environment that once made such a trajectory seem almost predictable had shifted. New immigrant groups had their own struggles with crime and opportunity. The specific matrix of ethnic identity, labor politics, and mob influence that had shaped Peter's youth was far less dominant. In that sense, his story came to represent not just an individual fall and partial redemption, but the end of a particular chapter in New York's history. The legal notion of closure rarely maps neatly onto such lives. There was no single moment when his obligations to the government ended. His security was assured beyond any doubt, or the harm caused by the schemes he had participated in could be said to be fully addressed. Instead, what emerged over time was a kind of rough equilibrium. He remained alive and under protection. The major figures he had implicated were serving long sentences. The institutions they had corrupted operated under increased oversight, and the criminal organization he once helped lead functioned in a diminished, altered form. For historians, this equilibrium raises further questions. How should figures like Peter be situated in the broader narrative of 20th century American crime and law enforcement? Are they best understood as perpetrators who later became tools of the state, as flawed agents of a kind of delayed justice, or as emblematic of structural shifts that neither they nor their handlers fully controlled? There is no single answer, but his case has provided ample material for such debates. What remains beyond dispute is that, without his cooperation, the public record of the Lucchese family's late 20th century history would be markedly thinner. We would know less about how municipal contracts were carved up in back rooms, less about the precise chain of decisions that led leaders to attack their own, and less about the internal culture that governed who lived, who died, and who was permitted to profit. The secrecy on which the mafia depended was never total. Journalists, police, and local residents had always glimpsed pieces of the picture. But Peter and those like him supplied connective detail of a kind that only long-term insiders could provide. By the time his name appeared only intermittently in new documents, usually as a cross-reference to earlier testimony, his most visible work in reshaping that public record was complete. The man who had once been a quiet presence on Brooklyn corners, then a captain managing multi-million-dollar schemes, then a wounded would-be casualty of an internal purge, and finally a central figure in a series of landmark trials, receded into the protective shadows of a life defined now by caution rather than command. In that withdrawal lies one more irony. The organization that had once prided itself on secrecy ultimately forced one of its own to lay bare much of its hidden structure in order to save himself and his family. The state that had once struggled to penetrate that secrecy now devotes resources to maintaining a different kind of opacity around his later years, in the name of keeping him alive. Between those two poles, the exposed past and the shielded present, stretches the complicated arc of a life that both profited from and, in the end, helped disassemble a powerful criminal world. Today, if you drive past the low-slung auto shops and strip malls of Staten Island, there is nothing to mark the spot where Peter Chiodo fell under a hail of bullets in 1991. The neighborhood, like much of New York, has changed. Different storefronts, new residents, a city in perpetual motion. The ambush that once sent shockwaves through the underworld is now a line item in old police reports, a paragraph in legal opinions, a few seconds of archival footage in crime documentaries. The man at the center of that drama has vanished from public view, buried not in a cemetery but in layers of bureaucratic secrecy, relocated and renamed under federal protection. In the public record, the trail of verifiable facts about Peter largely runs out after the late 1990s and early 2000s. Specific details about where he lives, how he spends his days, or even his current state of health are deliberately withheld by the U.S. government. That opacity is by design. The witness security program exists in tension with the transparency that otherwise governs criminal justice. Its success depends on making people like Peter as invisible as possible, once their usefulness as witnesses has been exhausted, and the main threats against them have, at least in theory, diminished. What remains visible, and continues to take shape as time passes, is the question of how to situate his life in the larger story of the American Mafia and the institutions that opposed it. By the 2010s and 2020s, New York's organized crime landscape looked very different from the one that had formed him. The five families still existed, and law enforcement efforts against them still produced indictments and convictions, but the scale and audacity of their operations had shifted. The grand, multi-family cartels that once quietly dominated entire sectors, like the Windows conspiracy in public housing, had given way to more fragmented ventures. Sports betting operations, online gambling portals, niche frauds, and opportunistic drug networks. This did not happen because of any one person. Economic restructuring, demographic change, decades of prosecutions, and new forms of globalized crime all played a part. Yet the testimony of insiders like Peter accelerated that transformation. By turning the Mafia's oral, secretive culture into something written, cross-examined, and archived, they helped close off certain paths that had previously seemed almost secure. Prosecutors and regulators could point to sworn accounts of how union locals had been captured, how municipal contracts had been carved up, and how violence had been used to police the edges of those arrangements. Once those methods were fully exposed, repeating them carried a much greater risk. Peter's story has, over time, become a kind of hinge between eras. On one side stands the post-war world he was born into, tight-knit Italian-American neighborhoods where organized crime coexisted with, and sometimes masked itself as, community leadership, a city economy in which unions and construction firms could be steered from back rooms, a criminal subculture that wrapped brutality in a language of respect and tradition. On the other side is a legal and social environment in which that subculture has lost much of its ability to operate unchecked, hemmed in by RICO, long sentences, and the proven willingness of high-ranking members to testify. In that sense, his life can be read as an illustration of how institutions change under pressure. For decades, the Mafia imposed its own order where state authority seemed distant or indifferent. It offered economic opportunities, some illegal, some quasi-legal, to young men who felt excluded from mainstream paths. It policed disputes among its participants and exerted quiet influence on everything from which contractor got a city job to which bar stayed open on a given block. The state, for its part, oscillated between periods of intense focus and stretches when organized crime was treated as a secondary concern. The turning point came when law enforcement agencies, pushed by public scandals and armed with new statutes, decided to treat the mafia not as a series of local nuisances, but as an integrated, long-term threat to the rule of law and public resources. The commission case of the 1980s, the Windows prosecution, and the trials of bosses like Amuso were the visible expression of that shift. Peter's trajectory, rising within that older system, then helping prosecutors attack it from within, made him both a product of the old order and an agent, however reluctantly, of the new one. For Italian-American communities, his story has always carried a particular weight. On the one hand, it reinforces a stereotype long resented by many, the association of Italian surnames and Catholic parishes with organized crime. On the other, it underscores how a small subset of men, operating within specific economic niches and historical conditions, can cast a shadow that far exceeds their numbers. Sociological studies and community histories from the late 20th century repeatedly emphasize that the overwhelming majority of Italian Americans in neighborhoods like Peter's pursued ordinary lives, often working in the very industries that mobsters tried to exploit: construction, trucking, small business. Understanding his life in context means holding both truths at once, acknowledging his very real role in criminal activity without reducing an entire ethnic experience to that single thread. As more archival material from the era becomes accessible, FBI files released under Freedom of Information requests, court exhibits unsealed after appeals, oral histories from retired investigators, researchers find themselves returning to the same episodes in which Peter played a central part. They revisit the Windows contracts to trace how many millions of dollars were diverted or inflated. They analyze the internal dynamics of the Lucchese family under Amuso and Casso to understand how fear of cooperation reshaped decision-making. They examine the witness protection program that absorbed Peter and his relatives as a case study in the human costs of both organized crime and the state's methods for combating it. These inquiries rarely produce simple moral verdicts. Instead, they reveal layers of contradiction. The same man who helped rig bids that drove up costs for public housing residents later provided the detail needed to reform those contracting processes. The organization that claimed to be rooted in honor and family sanctioned attacks on women and children when it felt its leadership threatened. The government that struggled for decades to penetrate the mafia's secrecy now shelters some of its former captains under new names, honoring a promise of protection made in exchange for their testimony. For Peter, the personal implications of that promise have likely been both stabilizing and isolating. Life under a new identity requires a continual negotiation between the past and the present. Simple social interactions, meeting new neighbors, applying for work, seeking medical care, are threaded with precautions. How much can be revealed to whom and under what circumstances becomes a daily calculus. Former cooperators have described the surreal experience of watching dramatizations or documentaries about cases they lived through, while sitting anonymously in a living room somewhere far from the city where those events unfolded. It is reasonable to assume that Peter has experienced some version of that dislocation, seeing his own name, image, or testimony surface in media he cannot publicly acknowledge as part of his life. The question of remorse, so often raised in discussions of former criminals who turn witness, is particularly complex in cases like his. In courtroom appearances, he expressed anger and disillusionment at the attacks on his family and acknowledged his participation in the schemes prosecutors laid out. Beyond that, the record is largely silent. The justice system did not require him to narrate an inner moral journey. It required him to tell the truth as he knew it about specific crimes and conspiracies. Whatever private reckonings he may have undertaken, about the years he spent enforcing the will of the Lukey's family, about the fear and financial harm experienced by those he helped extort, remain, by design, outside the public eye. What can be assessed, more concretely, are the outcomes his cooperation helped produce. Bosses and captains who once operated with relative impunity were held accountable in court and removed from the streets. Large-scale rackets in the construction and public housing sectors were disrupted, forcing both public agencies and private firms to change how they did business. Other potential cooperators, watching the arc of his case, saw that the government was capable not only of imposing long sentences, but also of protecting those who chose to assist in dismantling criminal enterprises. Whether one views that last effect as positive or troubling, it undeniably shifted the strategic landscape within organized crime. By the 2020s, as new generations grew up with the mafia more as a media genre than a lived neighborhood reality, Peter's story joined a canon of real-life narratives that complicated the romanticized images of earlier films and novels. Television series like The Sopranos had already dramatized the pressures of the RICO era on fictionalized mob families, including the fear of informants and the strain of balancing suburban respectability with criminal obligations. Documentaries and long-form journalism then layered in the nonfiction accounts. Men like Peter, who had actually navigated those tensions and paid for them in blood, prison time, and exile. In classroom discussions, whether in criminology courses, law schools, or seminars on modern urban history, his case offers multiple entry points. It invites questions about how particular legal tools, like RICO and witness protection statutes, alter the incentives inside criminal organizations. It highlights the role of individual agency within structural forces, how one man's decision to speak, prompted by both self-interest and profound personal betrayal, can accelerate broader institutional change. And it underscores the ways in which public and private harms intersect when criminal economies are embedded in essential services like housing and construction. New York itself carries, often invisibly, the imprint of those transformations. The public housing projects whose windows were once the subject of secretly allocated contracts now operate under stricter procurement controls, even as they face new crises of funding and maintenance. Union halls that were, in earlier decades, heavily influenced by mob-connected officials have undergone internal purges, federal oversight, or generational turnover. City agencies, stung by past scandals, maintain compliance offices and inspector general units that would have been unimaginable when Peter first began running errands for local wise guys on Brooklyn corners. None of this suggests a simple arc from corruption to purity. New forms of fraud and abuse appear as old ones are curtailed. The history in which Peter played a part serves less as a story of final triumph than as a reminder that vigilance, by law enforcement, by journalists, by ordinary citizens, is a continuous requirement. The exposure of one set of schemes does not guarantee that others will not arise. It only proves that complex, entrenched systems can be challenged when enough information is brought to light. In the end, what makes his life compelling as the subject of a long-form documentary is not that it offers tidy lessons or a redemptive finale. It is that it compresses, into a single biography, many of the contradictions that run through the history of organized crime in America. He was at once a beneficiary and a victim of the mafia's internal logic, a man who helped inflict harm and later helped to expose it, someone whose early choices helped entrench a corrupt order, and whose later choices contributed to its partial dismantling. The Staten Island morning, when gunmen stepped from the shadows and opened fire on him, did not, by itself, determine that trajectory. It was the culmination of decades of smaller decisions, his own and those of the men above him, and of larger social and legal changes unfolding around them. But that moment, frozen in police photographs and replayed in courtrooms through testimony, marks the point where the life he had built inside the Lucchese family could no longer continue on its previous course. From the vantage point of history, it is the hinge on which his story turns from internal actor to public witness. Somewhere under an assumed name, the man once known as Fat Pete has lived out years that the Lucchese leadership never intended him to see. Those years are his alone and in all likelihood will remain so. What we are left with is the record he helped create, a densely layered, sometimes unsettling portrait of how power, loyalty, greed, and fear intertwined in late 20th century New York. Through that record, we can trace the rise and partial fall of a criminal enterprise, the evolution of the laws designed to combat it, and the complicated human choices that bridged the gap between silence and speech. As the camera pulls back from the old neighborhood streets and the aging court buildings where he once appeared under guard, what lingers is neither celebration nor simple condemnation, but a sharper understanding of the era that shaped him. His life, with all its damage and disclosures, stands as a reminder that even the most secretive worlds are made up of individuals whose decisions under pressure can alter the course of institutions far larger than themselves.